Welcome to All About Kids. I'm David Wiggins. I'm the program manager for the Minnesota Historical Society here at the St. Anthony Falls Historic District. Behind me is our base of operations for guided walking tours which go throughout the historic district exploring the history associated with the water power of St. Anthony Falls and how Minneapolis grew up around the flour milling and lumber milling industries here. People come through our doors all spring, summer, and fall wanting to learn more about the state of Minnesota, as they've been doing really since 1858 when this building was built. Minnesota became a state in that year, and it's a very special place with many special qualities to it. And we're happy to send folks to the many historic sites and state parks and wonderful cultural attractions they can find throughout the state of Minnesota. We're going to be speaking today with the editor and the illustrator of a book called M is for Minnesota. It's a new A to Z book about Minnesota. And also with Jim Morse, the author of the Minnesota Free, all about various free things you can do in the state. And both books provide a wonderful introduction to the attractions and the history of our state. Folks who want to learn more about our particular area around St. Anthony Falls can come along on any of the guided walking tours we offer throughout the spring, summer, and fall months, or they can go around on their own and view the markers of the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Trail, which makes a loop across on the Stone Arch Bridge and the Hennepin Avenue Bridge and along the banks of the Mississippi River in between. Hi, we're speaking today with Todd Oriella and Janice Lee Porter. Todd is the editor and Janice is the illustrator for a new book out from the University of Minnesota Press called M is for Minnesota. Now there are maybe 1,000 A through Z books out, alphabet books out. This is a little different than a typical alphabet book, isn't it, Todd? How is this maybe different than what you'd find on the shelf with F is for farm? And
right. Well, I think this book has a lot more information in it than your typical ABC book, which are often written for younger readers, you know, as a primer to help kids learn their alphabet. This is really geared towards, fourth grade reading level. That's the grade in Minnesota where a lot of students learn a lot about Minnesota history. So, so it's really targeted at more experienced readers.
Okay. It's unusual for a university press to be putting out a A through Z.
This is our first children's book, but I think it fits really nicely with the other regional books that the University of Minnesota Press has published. This is also really kind of a gift book. I think it's a very popular gift right now during the holiday season. So it's written as much for adults as it is for kids, I think. So.
Now, do you know anything about Minnesota? And does the author know anything about Minnesota? You are the University of Minnesota Press, after all.
Sure. Dory Butler grew up in Fairmont, Minnesota, and she went to school up in Bemidji. And I am born and raised in Minnesota as well. So it was a fun project to work on with a native Minnesotan like Dory.
I imagine that it was difficult to arrive at a subject for each of the letters. Did you have any tough choices to make there?
Sure. Dory submitted a manuscript that had 26 great choices, and we struggled with some. X is a hard letter, Y is a hard letter. There are just some that are a little bit tricky. Q.
Well, X is not xylophone in this book, if I recall correctly. What did you come up with for X?
X is a little bit of a gimmick, but it works well. Cross-country skiing, and I'm an avid cross-country skier, and I think a lot of folks will know that sometimes when you go to a trail, they'll say X-C for cross-country ski trail. So that's what we came up with. I think it worked really well. Janice made a great illustration, even though she's not a skier.
Janice, I understand you're originally from Chicago, but almost a native here now.
Yes, 20 years.
20 years. Well, that's close enough.
I think so.
Did you know about all the things they're talking about in the book before you started into this process, or did you have to do a little education?
Oh, I had to do a lot of educating myself. Yeah, I might have been acquainted with a fourth of the entries personally, especially the ones here in town, but no. Tons of research.
What was your favorite part of the research?
Well, I like it all, actually. I like going to the library. I have a good time at the library. So here I had 26 trips at least. The funnest part might be the beginning of the drawings, to go from what's in my head to putting something on paper.
When I opened up the R is for Red River Valley in this, and I noticed you gave that a double-page spread. Why was that?
Well, you know, we tried really hard to represent all parts of the state in the book, and obviously the Red River Valley is an important part of Minnesota, and it's very flat. You know, they had terrible flooding up there because the water just washes out forever and ever. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to do a double-page spread and really kind of convey the sort of horizontal nature of the landscape. So.
Now, when you go about creating an illustration like this, what's the process? What do you start with?
Well, I start in a meeting with, in this case, the editor and the designer and the manager of production. So we had 4 heads on the project. They had the text ready for the most part. There are a couple entries that changed, but the text was ready, and it was even, the type was designed. And again, we fiddled with that a little bit, but this shows what I saw when I went into my first meeting, a blank sheet with some words, so wide open. From there, you know, when I read the text, my first step is to get an image in my mind, I often get a style or a sense of where I want to head with this thing, and I did right away know that I wanted it to be quite lush, quite thick.
But also quite accurate. I see that you really are creating illustrations that nobody's going to call you on. If they've seen the real thing, they're not going to write a letter to complain that you got a detail wrong on.
Yeah, that was real important here. It's not fiction. So, for instance, something like Duluth, I went and took my shots. Went and visited a friend, got my shots of the aerial bridge. You know, scanned books, found the big boats, did what was ever necessary.
And you can see the lift bridge does look like the lift bridge in there. Nobody's going to write about that one. One of my favorite illustrations, and one that really grabbed my 5-year-old, was the O is for open heart surgery. I imagine you had a few discussions about that from the editor's perspective.
Sure, O was another really hard letter to illustrate, believe it or not, and you know, there was you know, a few alternatives, orchids and oredocs and so on and so forth, but you know, as part of the University of Minnesota, we thought this was a good opportunity to sort of promote the University of Minnesota hospitals. This was the first open heart surgery was ever done. So, you know, it was a fun illustration for Janice to work on, I think really challenging because it's a hard thing to represent. You know, it's kind of gory. But
well, that's what grabbed my little guy.
I tried to get Janice to put more blood in, but, you know.
And this is one that I really had to create. I had shots of these doctors operating at the time, you know, but we see their backs. We never see the person who's operated on, so I was winging it, hopefully accurately.
It must be a different experience for you with the University of Minnesota Press working on a children's book.
It was, and children's book publishing is a really different part of the industry than what we deal with here. We have a lot of publishers in town and a few children's book publishers, but for me, you know, I was kind of learning as I went along as well, and you have to get yourself in a different mindset because you're really trying to make sure the text is readable for a younger reading level, but also not so sort of simply written that it won't appeal to adults as well. So. But
since it was for kids, it was probably just a lot easier.
Yeah, I wish I could say that was true.
What, of all the illustrations in your book, do you have a favorite?
I don't have a favorite. I know during the process for a long time, my favorite was Duluth. It was the one that I nailed early on, and so it was my prototype. And I'll show you a little of my process.
Where we saw the photograph and
yeah,
what comes
after I took
photo.
well, then I did a real small sketch just to try to get my bearings.
I should mention while Janice is holding this up, you can see there's 2 illustrations here, and we designed the book throughout because obviously when you open a book you have 2 pages, so Janice had to pay attention to what the other illustration was that was facing as well in selecting colors and so forth.
Yeah, the spreads were important. Then from the small sketch, I did tiny color spreads. And as Todd said, we knew that the spreads would always be seen at one time, so color was real important to me. I tried to work out the problems a little bit in some of these
You seem to have
tiny
captured
paintings.
some Minnesota colors in there. Was that a deliberate effort?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I hope Duluth looks nice and cool.
Yeah.
And then from the little guys, we go to a full-scale drawing where I decide what my composition's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Nail it down. And then the painting.
We have our own favorite illustration in here, and probably our own favorite story. And I think it's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in a kid's book. And one of my favorites is H is for the Hinckley Fire. And now, this is a terrible disaster. This is a horrible thing that happened, and yet here it is in a kid's book. This is not typical children's book fare. You
Sure.
talk about the decision to include something that's not necessarily representing the state in the best light, but
Well, I think history is important, and making all the selections for the book, we want to make sure we had a good selection of geography and history and people and so on and so forth. So, and again, H is for Hinckley Fire. It's one of the most traumatic experiences in the history of Minnesota, certainly, and I think it's important for kids to know that, and kids can, instead of when they're in Hinckley, instead of going to the casino with their parents, they can go to the Hinckley Fire Museum and learn some good history. So,
excellent, excellent. Well, I would imagine that if you received this book as a gift and read through it and didn't know anything about Minnesota, you would have a pretty good overview of the state. And if you were a kid and didn't get out much, we're just learning about your state entirely through books, you could get a pretty good sense of the state of Minnesota just reading through.
I sure hope so.
M is for Minnesota, a new book from the University of Minnesota Press. And we're speaking with the illustrator of the book, Janice Lee Porter, and with the book's editor, Todd Oriola.
Well said.
When people learned about Minnesota at the end of the 19th century, they usually learned about flour milling. As this card from that time shows, we were the milling capital of the entire world at that time for flour milling, and would shortly be the lumber milling capital of the country too. Now when visitors come into our program office here at St. Anthony Falls looking for information about what to do with their 3 or 4 days in Minnesota, they're often pretty frustrated as we show them the information about all of our various historic sites around the state, about the attractions along the Mississippi River and the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, about the Minnesota State Parks, and about the many, many other things there are to do in Minnesota. There's a new book out called Minnesota Free that looks at not just the natural and historic sites around the state, but the full range of cultural and other attractions to be found throughout the state of Minnesota. We're going to speak with the author, Jim Morse. We're here now with Jim Morse, author of a new book called Minnesota Free, out from Nodin Press. Jim, Minnesota seems like a great place to do things that are free.
Well, I think so, and I hope a lot of other people agree with me. I've been through other states, and when I came here from Arizona, having lived there 7 years, I did a book in Arizona about free events. Then when I came to Minnesota, I discovered there were actually more free events here than even in Arizona.
A number of the events that are listed in here are, in a sense, not free, just tax supported. Is that correct?
Right, right.
The state park system.
Right. We decided to put that in as an addendum, but actually there's some that may say donations, but we felt that that's still free. You could donate or you don't have to donate. So.
Now, is this aimed primarily at people with kids or just anybody that is
I'd say
looking
it's,
for something?
in a sense, it's for anybody, but I think it's in a sense family oriented because when you look at it and examine it, there's like 300 and some odd venues, 110 cities. So if somebody decided to go to Duluth with their family, they could surround the area and decide to go to the Iron Mine area or up further north in the Gunflint Trail. So it really is aimed in a sense at the families.
Mm-hmm. And in order to make the cut, did you have to be absolutely free or could you just be cheap?
No, I think absolutely free, although I was on an airplane with some people and they were asking me questions about the book, and one friend of mine ran through the plane and started telling people, yeah, buy the book, it's called Minnesota Cheap, instead of Minnesota Free.
Now, did you actually go out and visit most of these places to test them out yourself?
About 70, I'd say about 3/4 of them in 2 years we visited. But when I'd forget something, I had a history buff who was the editor for Nodin Press who would remind me I left something out.
Send you off on another trip to go check it
Right,
out.
right, that kind of thing.
Well, that sounds like pretty fun research. Do you have some memorable moments from that?
Well, I have some memorable moments. I tell you, I've always fallen in love with Duluth. It's kind of a joke. In some of the movies I've seen recently, there was one, I forget if it was Men in Black or something, some agent had done some terrible thing and angered the higher-ups in the FBI or CIA, and his punishment was to send him to Duluth. And I said if it were me, I'd be jumping up and down, extraordinarily happy,
Yeah, I've been
because
to
there's an
Duluth,
awful
but-
lot.
Yeah.
I think a lot of Twin City people love Duluth, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But I love watching the ships come in and hearing the announcement of the tonnage of the ship and where it's from. And it's amazing how many crowd, even in the cold, we've been there in cold weather, just before the winter sets in the ice, where you see people standing there buttoned up with their coats, the wind blowing, and they love it. And the Maritime Museum there is one of the best. I've been to about 6 maritime museums around the country, and I rate that as one of the top.
Well, you do hear the expression, the best things in life are free, and many of the best things in Minnesota are free because
Right.
you get to take in the natural beauty of the state, some of the areas that you can easily relate to just walking through.
Right, I think of the Gunflint Trail comes to mind, a recent visit, and there you turn left on the highway up by the ranger station. You're into the most beautiful area, especially in the leaves are changing colors. And you could visit nearby lakes, or you could head up toward Thunder Bay. And Grand Marais is right there. That's beautiful too. And there's so much of that in Minnesota. You could go south, east, north. And incidentally, the book is divided that way geographically, so that a person can look, and if they're deciding to go to Gunflint Trail, then they know that what other cities are near.
So this would be the sort of book you might keep in the glove compartment of the car, and when you're heading out on a trip, you'd look up in the index.
Yes, I was reminded of that
activities.
at a party I attended with some people, and some young woman came over to me and she said, you know what I like about your book? And I thought she was going to say the writing. She said, no, I like it that you could slip the book right into the glove compartment.
Okay, I'm not the first one to think of that. Is there something special about Minnesota in this regard? Do we have more free things than other states that you mentioned?
Yes, it's
richer
amazing.
Minnesota than-
I've lived in about 5 different states, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Arizona, a little bit in California. And I find that there are more free events here. And because of the diversity of the state, the lakes and the flatlands and the farm, I think there's more for a visitor or a native to see. But I've measured it against other states, and I don't see any similar books in New York or New Jersey. You don't see New Jersey free, or you don't see New York free. Not normally.
Well, there's a lot to do for free in Duluth and many other places in the state, but it seems like the real embarrassment of riches is right here in the Twin Cities metro area. Is that
Right.
true?
Well, it's fantastic. As the cover of the book shows, the sculpture garden brings a quick story to mind about how sometimes the press outside of Minnesota views us with kind of like a flyover state, to be honest, you know, a little bit. And one time I was in New York City, and I happened to pick up the New York Times, and believe it or not, there was a write-up on the sculpture garden, and they considered it one of the finest in the world. When you get that kind of a write-up when it's not a blizzard or a murder, we have to stand up and take notice. So the sculpture garden is one, the Capitol in St. Paul is another, the Landmark Center in St. Paul is outstanding. There's so many events that go on in Landmark Center that even my wife and I, we try to get to them. It's impossible on a Sunday to look at the paper and try to cover, and we're talking now free events. You could circulate all the ones in the churches and all the ones in the historic centers. And speaking of the historic center, the History Center is an unbelievable place for people to visit, right in the Twin Cities. But then I'm probably leaving out about 50 or 60, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you were able to cover the places that are free, but beyond the places, there are venues for many free events too, aren't
Right, right. There's I didn't go into detail on the festivals. I sort of did a brushstroke of the festivals because there have been some really good books about it. But as a state, we have a lot of festivals. I know the history people in the State Tourism Board publishes a very good newspaper in which they list all of them. And most of them are free. Every once in a blue moon, you'll see something. I sent some visitors once to New Ulm to the Oktoberfest, and some of the things there were pay and some were free, and I told them to kind of concentrate by the glockenspiel. Those were where the sing-alongs were.
Yeah. Is there a real seasonal nature to a lot of these activities? It seems like there are a few more things to do in the summer months.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The answer is yes, more in the spring and summer. However, I tried in some cases to mention where there was ski trails and snowshoes can be used, and sledding and hiking and biking. And with the weather we've been having lately, with the inversion of the greenhouse effect, we'll be seeing Floridians coming to Minnesota for vacation.
Do you see, or did you get a lot of people giving you all sorts of suggestions for the next edition? I imagine as soon as a book like this comes out, you're going to get call after call saying you left us out of here.
I was giving one, I wouldn't mention the name of the city, but it was a small little city. I was at a press party about the book, and a woman came over to me and she wanted to know why that little town wasn't mentioned, and I said, well, I'll be happy in the next edition if you could tell me the name of the city and what the event is. He says, well, I just moved there, I don't know.
It would seem like a book like this could be a very good incentive to move to the state.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I wrote this book for Arizona, the state, well, actually, it was a bank in the state who was after newcomers, and they used that Arizona book that I wrote as what they call the newcomer kit. And I don't know why we don't consider that, because let's say, I've got to give an example. In Arizona, the temperatures in the summer boiled to 117. I was there once when I lived there, it was 121. I couldn't believe it. And if you go a little further south toward Mexico,
that was
it's
above
hotter.
zero. Yeah.
Right, above zero, right, above zero. And I don't know why we don't promote in those states that suffer like that, Texas is included, the tremendous opportunities there are here, and it's so much more pleasant by the lakes and all the things we have to offer. We don't. I don't know why we don't. I don't think we do. I don't like to make any remarks about the state, but people in Arizona think of San Diego. Why not Minnesota?
Sometimes people make events and venues free because they somewhat underestimate them. But I think also in Minnesota, we just want to make sure everybody can get there, and we have this attitude to make it available to all the people.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that too, because, you know, I think there's another difference that I found in my book. We have a sense of humor in Minnesota which somehow escapes me in other parts of the world. If you travel east, and I'm sure you have, you see a lot of statues. You go south, the Civil War, everything is so serious. Here we have monuments to Big Ole, the Viking. We have a hockey stick in Eveleth that's the biggest hockey stick in the world.
That's a great visit.
Oh, Eveleth, you know, Eveleth is a great little town. I don't want to get into it. I'm a hockey fan, and the Hockey Hall of Fame is there. That's a paid exhibit, but you can just go through the town, and the iron mine area is so different, and we have this sense of humor that I think is missing, and I think that's part of it. We can make fun of ourselves in a very nice way.
Now, I could also see some use to this book in finding your way to good things that do have a modest charge. You mentioned you can go and look at the stick for free, but there's a slight charge to get into the museum. Historic Fort Snelling's listed in here, for example.
Right, excellent point. I think right away of Iron World. Iron World is fabulous. It's a paid exhibit. The way I got it in the book, I mentioned that there's a tremendous statue there of a miner, you know, you're familiar with it. And it's a great place for people, even if they're not going to go inside, to take some pictures. And I have several of that. I did it, I think, in New Ulm with the brewery. The brewery charges money, but there's a beautiful garden there. There's a lot of that. But I'm hoping that if that happens and someone is using the book, that they will go into Iron World because it's so fabulous.
Yeah, I would expect you'd have to be pretty cheap to be that close after having made the drive up there.
Right. I also mentioned in Excelsior area, Old Log, which is one of my favorite theaters, and it's so nice just to walk inside the theater and see the fireplace going and the coziness, and there's big grounds around there, and you're right near a part of Lake Minnetonka, and in the hope that somebody would look on the bulletin board and see there's a show going on and they might go in. So, and the same with the Ordway Theater, which is a marvelous architectural wonder. If somebody's browsing around there, perhaps they will decide to go in, but that's their decision.
You know, it says a lot about what we value in Minnesota. What we try to make free for everybody are the things that we do value.
Right.
And is there something special about Minnesota values that way, or
well, I think we have
characteristic?
In a sense, I think we love history. I think the average person, I'm not necessarily scholars, but just the average person will probably be able to tell you about, for example, our daughter lives in Northeast, and I know
Most
a little
people
bit.
love history.
Right. I know a little bit about it, but my publisher, Nodin Press, published a book on Northeast. But if you talk to someone from Northeast, they'll tell you exactly where the historic houses are and where the old restaurants and the area and the shopping area. The same with in University of Minnesota, in that little area around the town.
Oh, by Dinkytown?
Dinkytown.
Yeah.
Dinkytown is another area that they'll tell you about it and the history of it. It's remarkable.
Just soaking up the place and all of its ambiance is one of my favorite activities whenever I go traveling. And this seems like a great guide to be able to get me to the right place to soak it all in.
Well, it's nice because if you, as I say, I mentioned Duluth. I could mention Rochester, comes to mind quickly. I remember years and years ago, my friend kept publicizing Lanesboro. And I'd heard of it. My wife and I decided one day we're definitely going to Lanesboro. And it's not that exactly easy to get to because it's off a little bit of the beaten trail when you go down 52 or 53, I forget the number. And when you get to it, it's totally different. You don't really think you're in Minnesota anymore. It looks like New England, I think.
Right.
And then you get in there and there's bicycling and bed and breakfast and there's a DNR place and there's the waterfalls. And
And then did you get to Forestville nearby there too?
Yes,
Right.
there's amazing areas in Minnesota like that where you're in another world, right within the state.
We often think we know it all when we've lived here for many years, but I send people around the state as part of my day-to-day work, and I still found some things in here I didn't know about.
Well, I'm sure that I'm going to get a lot of answers. For example, there's one thing I thought of immediately. It's in a state park, Lake Itasca, the beginning of the Mississippi River, where I walked across, and I didn't exactly put that in. I mentioned it in the back of the book because the state parks are pay. But it came to mind of something I might have left out that was so fantastic.
Right. Often with the state park sticker or, say, a Minnesota Historical Society membership, you get in free to a whole big range of other activities.
And it's worth it. It is so worth it.
Most of these memberships are pretty reasonable.
Right. We have so many areas where you can take your family swimming, boating, canoeing in the boundary waters. Hopefully they won't make it into a motorboat paradise, I hope.
Well, it makes me happy I don't have to move to this state, that I live here already.
Right. That's true. That's very true.
We've been speaking with Jim Morse, author of book Minnesota Free, the state's best no-charge attractions, out from Nodin Press. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You gotta love Minnesota, and the more you know it, the more you like it. I lived here all my life, and I still haven't taken in every site there is to see around the state. We've heard today about two great ways to learn a little bit more about Minnesota. M is for Minnesota and Minnesota Free. Another great way to learn about Minnesota is to visit one of the many historic sites operated by the Minnesota Historical Society, including this one, where tours are available May through October. We invite you to come on down and see us and pick up either of these two books and maybe take a tour exploring our St. Anthony Falls Historic District. This is David Wiggins for All About Kids.